Montreal is one of the largest cities in Canada, and it's a city that has made huge improvements over the past few years with recent projects to improve public transit, install protected bike lanes, and even pedestrianize many streets. Since starting this YouTube channel, I've had a lot of people tell me that Montreal is the best city in North America. But that's kind of like saying you've got the best smelling outhouse, right? What I really wanted to know was, how does Montreal compare to the great cities of Europe? So I spent an entire week there to find out. Make yourself comfortable and grab a cup of tea, because this is the longest video I've ever made. Montreal is the largest city in the province of Quebec. It's located on this island creatively called Île de Montréal. The city doesn't quite consume the whole island and it's split up in weird ways, but that's not important right now. Now, I've been to Montreal several times, but the last time was over 20 years ago. What I remember most is that there were a lot of abandoned buildings and the roads were full of potholes. Now the abandoned buildings are being turned into condos and fewer roads are full of potholes. Montreal is a vibrant city with several mixed-use walkable neighborhoods, and actually the French language and history makes it more culturally interesting than most other Canadian cities. Plus there's poutine, which is so good with the proper squeaky cheese curds. Montreal has a pretty good public transit system, especially for Canada. The metro is made up of 4 lines with a total of 68 stations. The trains come as often as 2 minutes during rush hour and every 3 to 10 minutes off-peak. This makes it very easy to get around by metro, even if you need to change lines. Some of the stations even have cross-platform transfers to make transferring even easier. I'm a big fan of these. In general, the system is clean and fairly well maintained, and I used it a lot while I was visiting. One thing that's quite unique is that the Montreal Metro uses trains with rubber tires rather than steel wheels like a typical train. This is because the Montreal Metro is based on a technology used in Paris. In general, Quebec prefers to implement technologies from France rather than the US and Canada, both for practical and political reasons. I thought that rubber tires would mean that the trains would be quieter, but they're really not. However, these trains are some of the most reliable metro rolling stock in the entire world, so there are definitely benefits to this approach, but it gets better. There are big plans in Montreal to extend the public transit system through a new automated light rail system called the REM. When completed, the REM will be a comprehensive light rail system connecting Montreal and some of the surrounding cities. And although NIMBYs managed to cancel the eastern portion, most of the system will be opening in 2024. The first small part of this network had just opened a few weeks before I arrived, so I had the opportunity to ride it, and it's pretty great. The trains are bright and spacious, and the ride is comfortable. The stations have platform screen doors, which are important for safety, but also for reliability, as they prevent anything from falling onto the tracks. And the trains have level boarding, which really should be the norm for every new transit system everywhere. The trains are also driverless, which is really nice to see. There are so many metro systems in the world, including Amsterdam, that are struggling to keep up with demand because of a lack of drivers. So it's good to see Montreal building a driverless system from the start. But the best part of driverless trains is that you can sit up front and pretend you're driving. Whee! The REM vehicles are basically fancy dual-length trams, and there are questions as to whether these vehicles will be able to keep up with future demand versus building a standard metro system instead, but I'll leave that discussion to RM Transit, who has covered this project extensively, links in the description. One of the most impressive parts is that the construction of the REM only started in 2018, and the first branch opened in 2023, which is pretty fast construction, proving that new transit projects can be built quickly with enough political will. Now, when I judge a city, one of the first things I look for is how easy is it to get from the airport and into town. Specifically, is there a high-frequency rail connection to the rest of the city? Unfortunately, Montreal fails this test, and the only public transit from the airport is this clunky bus, which is really not good enough. However, I'm very happy to see that there are plans to extend the REM trains to the airport by 2027, so hopefully this situation won't be around for much longer. The biggest difference you'll see between Montreal and other Canadian cities is the type of housing. In short, the missing middle isn't missing here. In most Canadian cities, the majority of residential land is zoned only for single-family homes. These are the only type of homes that can be built there, which leads to this crazy situation where you will see only single-family homes and condo towers with almost nothing in between. Many cities are finally realizing that this is a ridiculous situation, though it took a serious housing crisis for anyone to do anything about it. Toronto, for example, has finally made it legal to build this kind of housing again. Montreal is a glimpse of what similar cities could look like in a few decades if they eliminated single-family zoning. This means that for most of Montreal, there is sufficient density to allow for efficient public transportation and enough foot traffic to support a multitude of small businesses. Montreal is also becoming very well known for its cycling infrastructure. The city has over 900 kilometers of bicycle lanes, and many of these lanes have been built in just the last few years. When I visited, I was very fortunate to be able to ride around with Stéphane Blais, one of the engineers who helped design a lot of this bicycle infrastructure. So I learned a lot about not just what they built, but why and how they built it the way they did. I rode around on the Montreal bike share bikes called Bixi. These are great for casual use. Like many bike share systems around the world, the system uses an app to unlock a bike from the dock. There are even e-bikes available too, which came in handy several times. But if you e-bike in Montreal, you are required to wear a helmet, and that includes the Bixi bikes. So I bought one at a local bike shop. Which honestly was fine, because there were several times where I didn't feel comfortable cycling without a helmet. I guess living in Amsterdam has made me soft. The bicycle infrastructure in Montreal varies greatly in quality. The older infrastructure is mostly just paint, but the newer stuff is quite a bit better. Although this one is one of the first bike paths that the city ever installed in the 1980s, and it's better than a lot of the stuff that came later. Some quiet residential streets just have signs allowing side-by-side cycling. Several one-way residential streets have these contraflow bicycle lanes. It would be nice if people cycling could always go the opposite way down a one-way street, but Canadian cities don't seem to like that idea, so these dedicated lanes are useful. And in this case, the bike lanes also narrow the street, which is best for safety anyway. It was also nice to see that some streets had temporary cycling infrastructure to make it safe during construction. I didn't see a lot of places for bicycle parking, but what I did see was decent. This bicycle area outside of one of the metro stations was definitely the best one I found. The most impressive neighborhood for cycling is probably Plateau Montréal, where the main street has been recently converted into a single lane of traffic in both directions with protected bicycle lanes on either side. This is part of the REV, a network of express bicycle routes across the city. These are marked clearly in blue so that they are easy to follow. You can see here where the REV diverts off of the main street with the blue paint and blue sign showing which way to go. Some of these REV lanes are very wide when the street allows for it. And these bicycle lanes are mostly designed for long-distance travel by bicycle. Only a very small portion of this network has been built, but the city plans to extend it by 2027. After a few hours of riding, Stéphane got a flat tire, so we walked to the nearest bike shop. I have to say, this is one thing that Canada does better than the Netherlands when it comes to cycling. A bike shop will actually fix a flat tire for you within the hour. In the Netherlands, or in Amsterdam at least, there are bike shops everywhere, but they're often so busy that you could be waiting days to get a flat tire fixed. While we waited, we checked out the nearby Jean Talon market, which is a lovely neighborhood market, with stalls for everyday groceries, as well as specialty shops and unique restaurants. On one side of the market, the street had been redesigned recently to provide more space for people, which is really nice. It does surprise me though that several streets of the market are still open to motor vehicles, and it's not just for deliveries. Most of these cars are just market customers who didn't want to walk. After the flat tire was fixed, we were off again, and during our trip, we rode on a lot of different bicycle infrastructure. And although there were definitely some good examples, a lot of other bike lanes were not exactly ideal. And it was interesting to get the stories from Stéphane about why certain streets were built the way they were. I regularly see people online saying that urban planners need to watch my videos so that they can learn what proper cycling infrastructure looks like. But in my experience, most urban planners know this stuff already. They've attended presentations about bicycle infrastructure, and they've been on study tours to the Netherlands or Copenhagen. The issue is not a lack of knowledge, but a lack of funding, a lack of political will, and difficulty changing the procedures of municipalities that have spent decades building only for cars. This means that there is a lot of bicycle infrastructure in Montreal that is experimental in order to build as much infrastructure as possible under the constraints of a historically car-centric city. In some places, a painted bicycle gutter is the only politically viable option. But you can see where, over time, even these are being slowly improved. This bicycle lane was recently widened, and you can see where the previous line was scraped off. When it's not financially feasible or politically viable to build permanent bicycle infrastructure, Montreal will use quick-build solutions. Here's an example of a two-way bicycle path built with flexi sticks. And they constructed this temporary bicycle traffic light on blocks. This needed to be built cheaply without changing the road design, but it also needed to be robust enough to be hit by snowplow blades. But these projects aren't always ideal, and it's clear that there are still compromises being made when making space for bicycles. Like this bike path that weaves back and forth because of demand for outdoor restaurant seating. Or in this case, where parking was removed, but not for this electric car charging spot. Montreal is also experimenting with proper raised bus stops that make it easier to board. This allows people to wait for and board the bus without blocking the bicycle lane behind them. These are only temporary, but they're a good example of the proper infrastructure that Montreal is trialing. Unfortunately, there are no Dutch-style protected intersections for cyclists, which was a bit disappointing. But it's not terribly surprising because these are pretty rare outside of the Netherlands. Even Copenhagen does not have protected intersections. The city does have this one intersection that uses curbs to protect cyclists in a similar way to a Dutch junction. This makes no sense on an intersection this small, but I was told this was done partially to test the concept in Montreal. Part of the reason why this rapid change is possible at all is that Montreal is governed very differently than most other Canadian cities. The island is not actually one city, but instead 19 boroughs and 15 cities that cooperate at various levels. This means that any decision on local issues, such as installing a bicycle lane or pedestrianizing a street, only needs to be agreed on by the local borough and not the entire city. This is why in Montreal, you will see neighborhoods like Plateau Montréal building out cycling infrastructure and safer street designs much faster than many other Canadian cities. One of these streets in the Plateau, called Pine Street, even though it doesn't have any pine trees on it, was recently redesigned. And you can see the direction that Montreal is going with its new infrastructure. It's a narrow two-way street with one lane in each direction for cars. There's a buffer with trees between the street and the bicycle lane, and the bike lane is pretty well designed with curb protection from cars and another small curb up to the sidewalk. You can see that this design is getting much closer to a proper Dutch-style street design. There are a few quirks though. These look like Dutch-style continuous sidewalks, but they're not. They were intended to be proper raised crossings, but due to compromises in the implementation, they ended up falling short of sidewalk level. You can see how they dip down and aren't continuous at sidewalk level at all. This is a good example of how difficult it is to change decades of car-centric thinking at all levels of government, but at least they're making progress. Some of these more recent street designs provide a much better pedestrian experience than most US and Canadian cities too. There are even some new crossings like this one, which are similar to the designs found in many cities in Europe. You can see here how the road narrows before the crossing, and there's a refuge island between the two car lanes so that people walking only need to focus on traffic coming from one direction at once. I've been told that Montreal drivers often do not stop for pedestrians, but at this crossing, almost all drivers stop, proving once again that road safety is less about bad drivers and more about bad infrastructure. These crossings also make space for native trees and plants, improving water absorption. One other thing I really appreciate when walking in Montreal is that drivers are not allowed to turn right on red lights. Allowing drivers to turn right on red is insanely dangerous to pedestrians, and this is something I've talked about in previous videos. Another great feature of Montreal is the green alleys. These are alleyways between houses that have been turned into places where kids can play, with very low car speeds and lots of greenery. These can be very easy to overlook, but I managed to find them in many different neighborhoods in the city. And of course, there are also several public parks. A lot of people told me I absolutely must check out the parks in Montreal, but to be honest, I'm not really sure why. Montreal has several parks, but I wouldn't say they're any more or less impressive or more plentiful than in most other decent cities. Some are big and some are small, and that's the parks of Montreal. They have been doing a better job than other Canadian cities at removing cars, though. Toronto might want to take the hint and get the cars out of High Park. But the absolute highlight of my trip was streets like these. Every summer, Montreal pedestrianizes about 10 streets, but these aren't just short spans from street to street. Some of these are dozens of blocks long from Stroad to Stroad. I cannot stress just how unique this is in Canada or in the United States. Sure, you might find a small pedestrianized street here or there in other cities in North America, but nothing comes even close to the number and length of these streets in Montreal. I saw people of all ages out enjoying themselves and waiting way too long to buy bagels, although they are great bagels. The streets were decorated with art and random quotes. There were lots of temporary installations for seating, greenery, and just fun things to do. Chairlifts on the street, sure, why not? It was interesting to see that these pedestrianized streets still permitted cycling, but inline skating and skateboarding was not allowed. Mopeds were also not permitted. And this sign mentions a pickup service for the physically disabled and the elderly. Most cross streets still allowed cars through though, and there were temporary bollards to direct traffic, which led to some strange bollard placement when surface parking lots needed to remain accessible. Some of the barriers were very solid, while others were not, which is how they allowed for necessary service vehicles to access these streets. I think the city has done a great job at designing these, given that everything is temporary and needs to be removed at the end of the summer. It was great that I got to experience these pedestrianized streets while I was in Montreal. I really enjoyed them. So that was my trip to Montreal. Isn't this an amazing city? And that's where this video could end. In fact, that's where almost all urbanist content about Montreal ends. Maybe there's some vague references about how the city isn't perfect, it's still North America, but that's about it. So for the rest of this video, I'd like to talk about some pretty major shortcomings I found during my time in Montreal. Things I haven't really seen mentioned in any other urbanist content. So if you don't want to shatter your rosy image of Montreal, you can pretend that the video is done right now. I'd like to thank my supporters on Nebula and Patreon for financing my fantastic trip to the best city in North America. You guys are the best. Have a great day. Okay, I think they're gone. Let's get real. First, some context. Montreal is on an island, but that island is chopped up by highways, and some of these highways cut right through the center of the city. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with highways. They're a great way to move vehicles from point A to point B quickly and efficiently. When highways are used correctly, they divert traffic away from city streets and onto the highway. But highways should go around cities, not through them. And the problems come when highways are used to funnel tens of thousands of cars onto city streets. And that is exactly the way highways are misused in Montreal. There were so many places where I found car sewers connected to highways. This highway even has its own backup highway next to it. This was one thing I really noticed about Montreal, especially when cycling. There are highways everywhere. In some places, they try to make it as safe as possible for people cycling, which is great. But it still amazed me just how much land on this island is dedicated to highways and related infrastructure. These highways were built in the 1950s and 1960s when elevated expressways were all the rage. But now they're crumbling and nobody wants to pay the billions of dollars required to repair them. Historically, Montreal was an island of streetcars. Look, there were so many lines that they overflowed outside of the map. This means that a large part of the island is one big streetcar suburb, with medium-density mixed-use walkable neighborhoods. Of course, all of these streetcar tracks were torn out to build car infrastructure in the 1950s and 60s, and this is the source of most of the problems with Montreal today. Streetcars, or what sane countries call trams, are extremely efficient for urban transportation. When you remove streetcars from a street and turn the street over to only cars, you significantly reduce the capacity of the street. So if you had a lane that could move over 5,000 people per hour by streetcar, you now have a lane that can only move around 1,000 or 2,000 people by car. So what was once a human-sized, slow-speed, walkable street with streetcars becomes a Stroad for high-speed car traffic, with the only public transit being buses that get stuck in traffic. Instead of limiting streets to only local traffic and forcing through traffic to the many, many highways, Montreal makes basically everything a through street. I did find a few modal filters around Montreal like this one, and this one that prevents through traffic, but these were rare and the vast majority of residential streets were through routes for cars. This makes these streets a major source of car traffic. What's even worse is that they make many of these streets multi-lane one-way streets. Multi-lane one-way streets are terrible for cities. They are used in order to speed up car traffic, which is exactly the opposite of what you want for livable neighborhoods. A one-way road like this should not exist downtown, and although the bike lane is well designed, there's nothing on the other side, so this guy is cycling on the sidewalk. These one-way streets are also more dangerous to cross because there can't be pedestrian islands. These exist only because the speed of car traffic is more important than the safety of people walking. In some places, Montreal has been slowly improving some of these Stroady former streetcar streets, which is an improvement, of course. But a lot of these problems would be solved if they cut off through traffic, push cars to the highway network, and put the streetcars back. However, that is an extremely tough sell politically when there's been decades and decades of car-centric development. Plus, there won't be any money left after spending billions on propping up outdated highways anyway. Right now, Montreal is missing out on one of the biggest benefits of good quality surface transit. Transit as a walking accelerator. A way to get from one walkable area to another walkable area quickly and efficiently. This really helps to connect walkable areas and makes them more accessible. Transit in Montreal is heavily focused on long-distance travel, where stations are far apart and either underground like the metro or elevated like the REM. This makes short trips unnecessarily long because you have to go all the way down to the metro and all the way back up again just to get to your destination. Trams are much more convenient for short trips, and they are the ideal walking accelerator, but that's a topic for a future video. I found the surface transit in Montreal to be pretty poor. There are no trams anymore, and the buses are slow. Schedules are very unreliable because buses are often stuck in traffic and stuck at red lights. Like, why does this bus with dozens of people on it need to wait at this red light at all? And the backwards ticketing system means that dwell times, the time that transit vehicles spend at a stop, are way too long. It is insane how long this bus had to stop here to board 4 people. This made it very annoying for me to explore Montreal's great walkable neighborhoods on foot. I couldn't get from one area to another without waiting ages for a bus that would crawl along at a pace barely faster than walking. Now, it felt to me like the Bixi bike share is being used to fill the gap as a walking accelerator and to make up for poor surface transit. Unfortunately, bike share is an inferior replacement to good surface transit. A tram can take anyone, but bike share isn't useful if you can't cycle because you're carrying a bunch of things, traveling with children, or for any number of other reasons. Bike share is a cute idea when a small percentage of your population rides a bike as an easy way to get more people to cycle. But it just doesn't work when the majority of people ride bicycles. There's a reason why Amsterdam banned bike share back in 2017 and is only now reintroducing them in a very limited way, despite it being the first city in the world to introduce the concept of bike share back in 1965 and having a docked system back in 1999. I cannot tell you how many times I was exhausted from walking in Montreal and found the nearest Bixi docks completely empty, because in order to function, bike share needs a complex system of trucks that redistribute the bikes during the day, and this just becomes more and more difficult as the system grows. This is just not a scalable solution for mass transportation. The destruction of the streetcar network explains another major problem with Montreal. When you exit many of the metro stations, you're dumped out of the side of an absolutely terrible Stroad. But this makes sense when you understand that these Stroads were all streetcar streets. When the metro was built, they tore up the streetcars and handed all the space over to cars. So the area immediately outside of many metro stations is one of the most inhospitable streets in the whole neighborhood. Again, the valuable land surrounding a transit stop is squandered in favor of wide roads and parking lots. Some of these locations are absurd, like here, where you're literally dropped off at the side of a highway entrance. Like, come on, seriously? This is an insult to transit riders. I stayed at a hotel in the heart of Plateau, Montreal, what is considered by most to have the best urbanism in the whole city. So when I got off the metro, I was expecting some world-class urbanism. But when I exited the station, I saw this. I didn't even know what to make of this. It's like the middle of the street has been dug out to save drivers a few seconds of travel time. And to be crystal clear, this is not some far-flung suburb. This is what you see literally as soon as you exit one of the major metro stations in the plateau, the neighborhood that literally everyone told me I had to visit. Amsterdam has this one area bulldozed in the 1960s with a similar issue, though the road and bike paths have a much safer design, of course. And I have complained about this road in multiple videos. But I also made a video about how Amsterdam is trying to fix this. As far as I can tell, Montreal has no plans to change any of this. I want you to understand that this is as much bad urbanism as this is good urbanism. But there are dozens of videos and articles about this, while nobody mentions this despite it being only a few blocks away. Now, to be fair, if I had exited at Montreal Station instead, I would have been right in the middle of the most popular pedestrianized street. What a difference one metro stop makes. If there's one thing I learned about Montreal, it's that good urbanism drops off really fast. By North American standards, Montreal is building some great quality bicycle infrastructure, and after riding for a few hours with Stefan, I started feeling pretty good about riding a bike here. But once I started venturing out on my own, I realized just how fractured the network is. And because I didn't know what routes were safe, I ended up in a lot of places where it felt dangerous to cycle. You might have a bike lane like this, but then the only infrastructure becomes this one path, which turns into a very narrow shared sidewalk next to high-speed traffic, and next thing you know, you're expected to navigate these insane suburban intersections on your bike. Now, to be fair to Montreal, this is to be expected in any city that is recovering from being bulldozed for car infrastructure, but I was still surprised just how much of a difference there was from borough to borough. It became very clear that Montreal is building bike infrastructure not so much where it is needed, but rather where it is politically acceptable to build. This leads to some very strange infrastructure choices. Like, there will be very high-quality bicycle paths along pretty minor residential streets, but then absolutely nothing on major dangerous roads. This was very strange to me because, for example, in the Netherlands or Denmark, small residential streets usually have no bicycle infrastructure at all because they're quiet residential streets with 30 km/h speed limits and minimal car traffic, while the expensive protected bike lanes are reserved for major roads with more cars and higher speed limits. Part of the problem is that almost all residential streets in Montreal are through streets, so they have a lot of car traffic, as I mentioned earlier. And most residential streets are very wide with no traffic calming. I found only a few streets with speed bumps. Though I did find this pretty wacky street narrowing with flexi posts which slowed cars extremely well. This really shows you just how much drivers slow down when the street is narrowed. But for the most part, residential streets had very high vehicle speeds, which is why the city needs to overbuild the bicycle infrastructure in order to be safe, even on streets like this. But it means that the cycling budget gets spread very thin and there's no money or political will to build anything on the major roads. For example, I needed to cycle down this Stroad, but I didn't because it was too dangerous. But just one block over was this protected bike lane on a tiny residential street. So it's good that I was able to cycle here, but this isn't where I wanted to be, right? I had to take these kind of detours regularly when trying to get anywhere, and it was very frustrating. Of course, the problem with cycling on smaller streets in North America is the ridiculous number of stop signs. Arrête signs. Thankfully, Montreal cyclists ignore stop signs, which they should because stop signs are stupid and should not be used in this way, as I've talked about in a previous video. But of course, this is technically illegal, and it means that any bored cop looking to fill his quota can ticket you for it at any time. I also noticed that a lot of the protected bike paths in Montreal were two-way. These are sometimes called bidirectional bike lanes. There's a reason why traffic engineers do this, because putting the bike lanes together lets them get a little bit of extra space for bikes without taking space away from cars. And on multi-lane one-way streets, car lanes can be slightly closer together, which also leaves a few extra centimeters to make bike lanes wider, again, without taking space away from cars. But these kind of lanes can be dangerous in certain situations and probably should not be used on a street like this. Bidirectional cycling paths are not recommended on streets with a lot of cross streets and driveways, as drivers are not expecting to look for traffic coming from the opposite direction. This relatively minor intersection in Toronto is one of the most dangerous for cyclists in the whole city for exactly this reason. This bidirectional path near the waterfront in Montreal has long stretches between cross streets, and this is a reasonable design, though it does suddenly end with a walk your bike sign. And this bidirectional path was recently removed and replaced with wider one-way bicycle paths on either side of the road, which is a safer long-term solution. I definitely felt like there were way too many cross streets on most of these two-way cycling paths though, and without any protected intersections, of course. In some cases, Montreal mitigates the danger of lots of cross streets by having a stoplight at every intersection, which is really annoying. I ran into so many red lights when cycling in Montreal, which made cycling very slow. But I generally prefer taking transit over cycling anyway, and while I was checking out the new REM trains, I met up with these two guys who were in town doing the same thing. Bunch of transit-loving weirdos. But beyond that, there were 3 people I planned to meet up with in advance. 2 in Montreal proper, and 1 up here in Val-David. All 3 of these places were difficult or impossible to reach by public transit, even the 2 that are officially part of the city. These 2 may become more accessible when the full REM system is completed, though. But like all Canadian cities, it would definitely be a compromise to live in Montreal without owning a car. Intercity train service is very limited, and even going to Toronto, Canada's largest city, there are only 6 trains per day. Not per hour, per day. At least they do have Communauto, a local car sharing program. But since we weren't members, we had to rent a car to get to Val-David, which was about as much fun as you'd expect it to be. Val-David used to have a train station, which is now a cycling path that is quite well used. But like almost all of these rails to trails projects in North America, this would have more value if it were still a train station connected to Montreal. Outside of Montreal, we encountered the same awful car-dependent places like anywhere else in Canada. But in the end, we did meet up with this person. I never ended up meeting up with this person as we couldn't make the timing work with public transit. And as for this person, we agreed to meet halfway. He would drive, and I would take the subway. We agreed to meet at the Orange Julep, a classic boomer-era burger joint. So I took the metro out to Namur Station. The station itself was opened in the 1980s and had some pretty interesting artwork. Neat. But then I stepped outside. Holy shit! I have taken public transit in literally hundreds of cities around the world, and I have never in my life seen the area outside of a metro station that was this bad. Harvey's may make your hamburger a beautiful thing, but a Harvey's parking lot and a literal highway entrance is not a beautiful thing to see when you exit a metro station. To get to the restaurant less than 300 meters away, I had to cross a 4-lane one-way Stroad, a 6-lane highway, and another 4-lane one-way Stroad. There were thousands of cars. It was loud and polluted, and it was an extremely uncomfortable place to be outside of a car. It amazes me that this subway station has been open for 40 years, and the land use around it is still this bad. And this is not the suburbs of Montreal. This location is less than 7 kilometers from downtown and well within the center of the island, which is pretty wild. I think you can understand what I mean when I say that good urbanism drops off really fast in Montreal. But hey, at least I got to eat in a restaurant shaped like an orange. I mentioned earlier that Montreal is split into several political regions, which gives them that sweet, sweet local governance. But the flip side is that there are many boroughs and cities which don't want to or can't build proper infrastructure, and that's where a lot of these drastic differences come from. If the bike lane suddenly ends, it's probably because you crossed into a new borough or city. I took a trip out to East Montreal, and I could see the infrastructure getting worse every time I crossed the border into a new borough. The streets out here are very wide and there are lots of cars. And if there's any bike infrastructure at all, it's pretty awful. They do have more missing middle housing than most Canadian neighborhoods, but it's still very, very car-centric. Transit service is pretty patchy here, so I got stuck and ended up taking a taxi back to the city. Another independent city is Westmount. Despite being on the island and surrounded by Montreal, Westmount is an English-speaking enclave that's its own city, with lots of large, historic, single-family homes. There's no subway station within Westmount, but there are buses. Westmount also has this nice bike path, but I made the mistake of trying to ride down their main Stroad, and it was not fun. I decided it was safer to pull over and walk. Now, not everyone in Westmount is insanely wealthy. This poor guy is so hard up, he needs to hand wash his own Maserati. And there are a few bike paths, but for the most part, it's kept pretty car-centric. But it's still better than the neighboring Côte des Neiges, who voted to remove a bike lane in 2020, and then hired consultants to spend $150,000 on an exhaustive study to put it back, just for the study. Like, the entire fucking project shouldn't cost that much. So I guess the trick with Montreal is to live in a neighborhood that's wealthy enough to have people who will advocate for better urban infrastructure, while not being so wealthy that they advocate against it. I also visited some of the suburbs of Montreal, but they were not good. They were pretty much exactly the same as everywhere else in Canada. They do have these wacky horizontal traffic lights though. And there is more missing middle housing than is typical outside of Quebec. Occasionally I found some multi-use paths that were decent, but giant parking lots and giant Stroads are the norm here. This is typical Canadian car-dependent suburbia. I had to take several taxis because I got stranded by public transit, and it was generally a waste of my time. For example, I made the mistake of trying to take an EXO train, but I got stuck out in suburbia, at a train station with a highway on one side and a giant parking lot on the other. Silly me for thinking a regional train might, go to the city during the day. EXO is a typical commuter rail system that is basically only useful for suburbanites to come into the city for work. I've made a previous video about these ridiculous systems, so I won't expand on that further. At first I thought maybe I could walk around for a bit and film the suburb, but the Stroad right outside the train station had no sidewalk, and I wasn't willing to risk my life for more footage of shitty Canadian suburbs. So again, I took a taxi. I was impressed though that the metro station in the suburb of Longueuil had a lot of buses going to it, and there was a university right next to the metro, with some decent bike parking. Unfortunately, the whole area is literally surrounded by highway interchanges, so it's not much fun getting out of here on foot. I was also surprised by what I didn't see in Montreal. A common trend in great cities are new neighborhoods that are being built to be nearly car-free from the start, such as Houthavens in Amsterdam, Europaplatz in Zurich, or Van Kunsten in Oslo. But even the new downtown neighborhoods I visited in Montreal were still being built to be very car-friendly. This is really disappointing because it's locking in car-centric design for generations. There's a common situation that exists in North American cities that I call Walkable Islands. Every city has some nice places. That's not something unique. You can paint a good picture of literally any city if you want, if you pick the right spots. Even fake London has Wortley Village, the Thames Valley Path, this bicycle intersection, and that one block of Dundas Street. But these good places are like islands. Small pockets of good urbanism among a sea of Stroads, highways, and parking lots. We experienced this in Toronto, where things were pretty good, as long as we didn't leave our little walkable island. And I experienced the same thing in Montreal. Now, to their credit, their walkable islands are bigger than Toronto's, and there are probably more of them too. But let's be clear, those fantastic photos and videos you see from urbanists on YouTube and Shitter are taken on those walkable islands. My travels in Montreal were pretty consistent. Every time I went to one of the places recommended to me, I was seriously impressed. But every time I veered even slightly off script, sometimes even just by a few blocks, I regularly encountered terrible urban places. I stayed in two places in Montreal, an apartment near downtown and a hotel in Plateau, Montreal. When I got to my hotel, I thought I had booked the wrong place. Everybody told me that Saint Denis in the Plateau was one of the best streets in the city, but it looked like this. Fortunately, I realized I was just too far south. The good stuff starts here. Now, I'm not going to fault Montreal too much for this. Every city repairing bad car infrastructure will have some streets that have been fixed and others that have not. Still, it was funny that 2 blocks north was this, and 2 blocks south was one of the temporary pedestrianized streets, while my hotel was on this landing strip. Still, it did make me realize that Montreal was not as great as I'd been led to believe, even on the best street in the best neighborhood in the city. The other place I stayed was just around the corner from this street. Now, this is really nice, right? There's this nice big sidewalk with trees and benches, and this provided me with a lovely first impression of the city, so I decided to go for a walk. I walked 1 block south, and this street was not so nice, a wide one-way street with high-speed traffic. It was undergoing construction though, so maybe this will become a bicycle lane? I also noticed that there is a lot of parking in Montreal. If you can't find a spot on the street or in this surface parking lot, don't worry, there's a parking garage right here. It was nice to see at least some of this turned into restaurant seating at least. A short walk farther south though, I hit this terrible Stroad, right through the center of downtown. This definitely fits the definition of a car sewer where people on bicycles are squeezed between high-speed cars, and the only transit is buses stuck in traffic, in other words, a typical Canadian city. Okay, 1 more block south with this nice little bump out for pedestrians to make safer crossings. Not bad. and here was a metro station. But then I noticed this sign. Why were people walking and cycling not allowed on this side of the street? And they're all forced to share this one dingy sidewalk. When I got to the end, I found out why. This is a literal highway entrance. Again, this is not suburbia, this is right near the center of the city. I pulled out my map to find the best way to get out of here. This is not how I expected this walk to go. I told my phone to take me to the train station, assuming it must get better from here, but it didn't. Downtown Montreal is awful. It's full of highway entrances and exits, and giant Stroads. And there are still several surface parking lots around too. Look at the size of this sign. This doesn't belong in the middle of downtown. This is one of those brilliant ideas right out of the 1960s. Bulldoze the downtown, build a bunch of highways, and create a central business district for suburbanites. And that is downtown Montreal in a nutshell, a place for suburbanites to come by car. There is no way in hell you would find me cycling on a Stroad like this. It's such a shame because you can see some glimpses of the historical walkable city that used to be here, before it was bulldozed to build garbage like this. When I visit somewhere, I try to get a realistic view of the whole city. I don't just visit the highlights and call it a day. Of course, this is the internet, so I've still had people accuse me of cherry picking. I remember once laughing and saying, what, do you think if I just turned around, there'd be some giant intersection of 6-lane Stroads or something? So funny, except that is literally the case in downtown Montreal. This is a nice little parquet, right? But turn around and sure enough, it's surrounded by 6-lane Stroads. Now, I haven't been to Calgary for a while, but I could easily see this being the worst downtown of any major city in Canada. The best part of downtown Montreal is definitely the Old Town, with its historic buildings and cobblestone streets, though it is quite a small part of downtown and still accessible by cars, and to get there, you need to cross this Death Star trench that cuts right through the city center. But for me, Old Montreal was depressing because the rest of downtown probably looked something like this before it was bulldozed. There's also this enormous parking garage right by the waterfront in Old Montreal, which is owned by the provincial government, not the city, so it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Now, downtown Montreal also has the réseau, or underground city, effectively an underground network of paths connecting adjacent buildings. These exist in a lot of cities with cold weather, such as the Path in downtown Toronto, or the Plus 15 in downtown Calgary. I am not really a fan of these, and someday I should make a video about how these suck the life out of downtown streets. A lot of these pedestrian networks were built in the 1960s and pitched as an escape from the cold, but the primary motivation was to reduce the number of pedestrians on the street so that they didn't interfere with the flow of car traffic. And personally, I don't think it's a good idea to privatize your downtown and hand it over to a few large property owners. These connected malls span over different skyscrapers owned by different owners, so they are usually maze-like and difficult to understand for infrequent visitors and tourists. And you can see that outside of office hours, this place is a dead zone. These networks are usually only popular with office workers and apparently people who still listen to Metallica. Because of all the winding routes through changing levels between buildings, this underground mall would be extremely difficult to navigate in a wheelchair. I had enough trouble just getting through it with a rolling suitcase. You know what would be a great solution to this? Putting the shops back on the street. I did get to the train station, however. Now, there's something I like to do in every city I visit, and that's what I call the Hauptbahnhof test, because I got the idea in Hamburg. When you exit the main train station, are you safely and easily able to transfer to surface transit, like here in Basel, or are you immediately confronted by cars and high-speed traffic, like here in Hamburg? Montreal fails this test spectacularly. The train station is effectively hidden. It's surrounded by Stroads and almost impossible to find if you're not looking for it. The main entrance is hidden down this smaller side street. And when you go through the front entrance, you get here, a parking lot and a rental car pickup area. I'm pretty sure this is the worst train station entrance I've ever seen, especially since this is the only train station in Montreal. Thankfully, the new REM station is accessible in the train station, but it took me a while to find it because I didn't realize that an R with a line through it meant public transit. I really don't understand why the REM had to be branded differently than the rest of the metro. It seems needlessly confusing. Now, I wanted to take the metro back to my hotel, and theoretically, you can get the metro from the train station. But despite lots of signs for rental cars, it's difficult to find the entrance to the metro. Eventually, I figured out that you walk down this escalator that isn't working, down these stairs and around the corner, through these doors, and then turn right, then down this hallway and another small set of stairs, and then this escalator, which also isn't working, so go down the stairs, a very long set of stairs, then down this hallway and through these doors, and the metro station is right here on the right. You would really have to be trying to make this transfer any less convenient. But here's where we get to the most insane part of the Montreal Metro, the ticketing system. Most modern metro systems use some kind of smart card, and Montreal has the Opus card. Now, on most metro systems, you load money onto the card and it's deducted when you tap it. And you can set up an auto top-up to add money when you're running low. Even better, contactless payments with a phone or credit card are available in many cities. Even Toronto does this now, but Montreal is different. Here, you don't load money, you load individual tickets or passes, and the only place you can do that is at a physical ticket machine. This means that there are enormous ticket lines at every metro station. What's worse, even if you have a weekly or monthly pass, you need to load this using the machine, so near the first of every month, the lines are even longer. And to make matters worse, I found many ticket machines were out of order. Even this one at the brand new REM station, and don't even get me started on how bad the land use is around the suburban REM stations. Unfortunately, that's pretty normal for Canadian transit. Of course, the pedestrianized streets in Montreal were absolutely great, but there are also important caveats here too. These are only temporary. The longest of them is open for about a third of the year, but most of them are open for less than 15 weeks. So if I had visited at almost any time of the year besides summer, I would have missed them. The argument here is winter, which, okay, fine. It doesn't stop Scandinavians from pedestrianizing streets, but Canadians do love to use winter as an excuse. My issue is that because these are temporary, a lot of compromises need to be made. Ultimately, the street needs to turn back into a place for cars, so this limits the design. For example, wheelchair users rightfully complained that the shops and patios would put displays or seating out that block the sidewalk, so these ramps were installed this year to provide more places to go up and down from the sidewalk level in a wheelchair. This is a great improvement, of course, but if this were a permanent implementation, it could be designed properly so that there isn't any curb at all like you see in many pedestrianized areas in Europe. And these planters are nice, and so is the temporary paint, but ultimately it could be designed to be so much nicer if this were permanent. A permanent street could have proper loading areas and traffic diversions too. Right now, having these flexi sticks everywhere is really ugly. I feel like these pedestrian streets would be so much more impactful and useful if they were 1/10 the length, but permanent. But I assume this temporary situation is all Montreal can get away with politically, and that's understandable. And I don't want to be too negative here because, again, there's no other place in the country that has done a better job than this. But the truth is, the majority of Montreal is not like this. It's more like this. Is this still better than most of the US and Canada? Yes, absolutely. And the city is definitely improving. But I remember sitting on this bus as it slowly trudged through traffic, and I seriously considered titling this video, "The Most Disappointing City I've Ever Visited." But that's not really fair to Montreal, because my expectations were just set too high from what I had seen online, and besides, I was saving that title for Philadelphia. I feel like Canadians have been gaslighting me about Montreal. I've been repeatedly told it's just as good as the best European cities, and there's lots of content online suggesting that too. I'm sorry, but these people are just wrong. I spent a week in Montreal, and I traveled extensively throughout the city, and I saw a lot of great things, and some very, very promising improvements. And I cannot stress enough how great these pedestrian streets are. But I also spent over $100 in taxis in a single day because public transit was so bad outside of the core region. And I ended up in a lot of places where I didn't feel safe walking or cycling, and spent a lot of time stuck in traffic, even on public transit. And all this in what I've been repeatedly told is one of the best cities in North America. Montreal really made me lose interest in making any more videos about US or Canadian cities. It's just not worth the time, cost, and frustration. And ultimately, I don't think Montreal is a great city. It's more like 5 good neighborhoods and a trench coat pretending to be a great city. But even I do have to admit, it's still better and improving faster than other Canadian cities, so it does have that going for it. So if you're a Canadian who appreciates good urbanism, someone who doesn't want to spend most of their waking hours surrounded by asphalt or behind the wheel of a car, someone who appreciates human-sized places, and if you're able to find a way to live and work in one of the great walkable islands, then you could really carve out a great life for yourself here in Montreal. Just, don't walk 2 blocks south. The cycling infrastructure, though not perfect, was definitely one of the better parts of Montreal. I did a lot of cycling while I was there, and I only showed a small part of that in this video. So if you'd like to see more, I actually have a whole other video with commentary on the rides that I did in Montreal, and it's available now on Nebula. Nebula is the subscription streaming service for educational creators. I release all of my YouTube videos to Nebula early, and you can watch them without any ads or sponsorships. And there are over 150 other creators who are also on Nebula, many of whom you probably already watched today. One of the most important parts to me about Nebula is how we're funded. We're not supported by ads, so your viewing will never be interrupted by an ad break. We're also not funded by venture capitalists who would inevitably enshitify the platform as they extracted the most profit from users. Instead, Nebula is supported by you, the fans who subscribe each month to watch great content. You can also watch Nebula Originals, exclusive content made possible only through funding from Nebula. Like Abigail Thorne's recent stage play The Prince, a project funded by Nebula. If you didn't get a chance to see it while it was playing in London or New York, then you can watch it now on Nebula. Nebula wants to fund more great original content, so for a limited time, Nebula is offering lifetime memberships. For a single payment of $300, you have permanent access as long as you and Nebula exist. A lifetime membership is the best way to support Nebula, to fund new content, and to support the development of new features for the platform. But if that's too much for you, that's fine. Nebula also has monthly and annual memberships. If you sign up using the link go.nebula.tv/notjustbikes, you can get a whole year of Nebula for just $30. That's not $30 per month, that's $30 per year. It's a pretty great deal. If that sounds good to you, then you can find all the relevant links below this video.